I talked to you briefly about policy this morning, and you know, policy is something that we need to engage in to move collectively in the direction we need to go, but I think for so many of us, where our passion lies is in educating and communicating about the wonderful things we're finding out about what lies beneath the soil and the important role that that can play in improving the sustainability of our agriculture and food system going forward. So you heard before that I work with the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program. And if you're not real familiar with that, we're a $27 million program which does a lot of research and education projects, but we also have a very strong outreach program. We actually have 7 full-time communications people on staff, and I chair our national effort with that. And one thing I've learned over the years working with SARE and some other sustainability communications efforts is that it's important to understand audience. So we'll look at that here in just a second. But first of all, Ron, I have a beef with you. You didn't give me a sticker when I came up here. So many of you have got these stickers today. I saw I dig healthy soil, and that's just one of the many creative things that have come out. All right. There you go. Have come out of Ron's shop, and you're going to see some others as we go through this today. But the thing I liked about this photo that Ron shared with me, and thanks for sharing several slides from NRCS's efforts, is that you can see it encompasses a wide range of ages and audiences. And that's what we're all about in terms of reaching a broader network of people on sustainability. And sometimes we think in agriculture, well, you know, the public, they're just, you know, why would they be interested in agriculture? But of course, it comes back, as you said, to we all eat. I think in Australia, some of you have heard of the land care movement. They have found that they've got 70% of the people in Australia know what the land care movement is about. Now, can we do that on soil health? Can we get 70% of the people in America or North America knowing what soil health is about, at least enough to say something about it? Now, I believe we could get there if we keep working at it. So just thinking again about audiences, by the way, before I list some audiences, this is kind of an interesting approach here. On the lower right, you see a trailer. It may be a little hard to see, but this was put together by a Soil and Water Conservation District in Boone, Iowa. They had some funding, and I wish I had a little video clip of the whole trailer, because you walk around and the whole trailer is covered with messages about soil health. And there's a little bit of a video screen on the front right there that they could do kind of on-site presentations at county fairs or state fairs or out on a farm tour. And you know, that's just one of many creative approaches that I hope to show you here in the next few minutes. So we often think about, with communicating about soil health, about farmers and ranchers. And obviously that's an ongoing need. Many of you are doing a great job in that area. But I was asked to talk with you really about other audiences, because we've already got so much good stuff happening with farmers and ranchers. So I know a number of you also work with ag advisors, and this is a big part of what I do with SARE, is looking at how do we reach those different ag advisors. A lot of times our work has been with Extension, NRCS, or conservation districts. But there's many other folks out there, and you're aware of this, that make a difference in farmers' decision making, and especially in the ag retail community, seed dealers, equipment dealers. I saw earlier about 50% of the audience that is in the private sector, and you folks are very important to what our farmers are thinking about, how they need to move forward. And it's not just those folks. Sean McMahon's pointed out we need to work with the financial community, the ag lenders, people involved in ag real estate, farm managers. We've got landowners, as was mentioned by our last speaker, as an important part of this, so I'll come back to that here in a moment, but definitely an audience we want to look at. And of course, the general public, as Ron alluded to, and something I was asked to touch on with you. So just thinking about the overall communications and education strategy, again, audience is important. I'm going to talk to you in more depth about ag retail community, landowners, and consumers. I also want to talk to you about messaging, and Ron introduced some of this, and we'll look at it a little bit further, but what are some key messages, and what are some creative approaches to those messages, and what are some resources that are out there that you might find helpful in your work? At the very end, I'm going to touch briefly on strategies, and this is an important part when we think about communications and think about education. Audience, message, strategy, those are key parts of what we need to be looking at. So in terms of soil health messages, there's lots of ways we can do messaging, right? We can do facts and statistics. We can do soil health principles, farming and ranching practices. Are we using cover crops or no-till or diversified rotations? Obviously, producer stories are a big one. We're going to look more at that. But we can also be creative. Again, NRCS has been great at this with Ron Shop. So we've seen catchy messaging like cover your assets or don't farm naked. So Chris Clayton, where are you at here, Chris? Chris took this photo and got a quick snapshot of our new Secretary of Ag, Sonny Perdue. Don't farm naked. You can see he got a big smile out of putting up that t-shirt. I'm sure that's stuck in his mind more than just having a soil health t-shirt with nothing else on it. So that catchy messaging, Practical Farmers of Iowa. I know Karen Scanlon, who's here, has used that cover your assets, for example, at Commodity Classic to try to get farmers interested in thinking a little differently. So we can be creative in that way. NRCS has done a terrific job with the Unlock the Secrets of the Soil. And again, I commend you, Ron, and your team and many others that have been part of that effort. And if you look at these materials, I would just encourage you. You may say, well, I've looked at NRCS's website a year ago, but I bet you're putting stuff on there, almost weekly, right? And every time I go back, I find something new, and I'm like, wow, this is great. And I'm using a lot of this stuff in our SARE educational programs. So keep looking at that site. Get on there every month or so, and you'll find some new and great stuff. Some of it is farmer-oriented, but a lot of it is more general as well. I think Ron put this slide together to talk about how the most powerful stories can be farmer stories, and that's something I very much agree with. You know, if we can tell how farmers are being successful with soil health or why they're motivated to do soil health, that is really good for almost any audience that we're working with. So in SARE, we put together, if you just Googled SARE Cover Crop Innovators, a series of about 24 short 2 to 3 minute videos. These are farmers from all across the country. The one featured there is Dan DeSutter from Indiana. And each of them talks a little bit about why they're doing soil health using practices like cover crops. Dan, in his little short series, talks about how he hopes, as a farmer, by the time he stops farming, to restore the organic matter in his soil to the level it used to be when the ground was first broken from farming. And he says that very passionately. And I think those sorts of messages that the farmers convey in these videos, you know, they're relevant to just about any audience. I find, you know, just the average person on the street who maybe has no connection to agriculture can respond to that type of messaging. A lot of the farmers, if you watch these videos, are talking about keeping living roots in the soil, and just as another example of a common message that's out there. So I want to switch from thinking about the general audiences to thinking about ag retailers. I've often felt, and I'm sure many of you would agree, that if we're going to go from having certain, like 20 million acres of cover crops, which is what we're approaching now, to having maybe 100 million acres of cover crops or more adoption of no-till, more adoption of other practices, that it's going to take the ag retail community to help us get there. Because they're the ones out there working on a daily basis with the farmers. And Gary Farrell, who's up here at front, recent president of the Ag Retail Association, has been very good about reminding me that if we don't work with that audience, you know, we're not going to get very far in trying to drive further adoption of these efforts. So when I look at the ag retail community, you know, part of it is what's in it for that community to get involved. A lot of ag retailers, interestingly, are now selling cover crop seed, for example. I was at a meeting in Iowa a little over a year ago, and about 30% of the ag retailers were selling cover crop seed, which sort of surprised me. Some of them are starting to plant seed with high clearance equipment like this that would normally be, of course, spraying herbicides or fungicides, but with maybe a quick changeover can be converted to spreading cover crop seed. So that's another way they can make business kind of at a slow time of the year, maybe in August or September, when equipment and their workforce is a little more idle. Obviously, many of them are already terminating cover crops in the spring. They're starting to do soil health testing and sending that off to the various labs that are out there. And of course, what's really important is helping the farmers understand those soil health test results and make some management choices based on that information they're getting back. So my hope for the ag retail community, and I know many of them, like Gary, are moving in this direction, is, you know, how do we get to the point where these companies are really about helping farmers manage their nutrients, manage their soil health, rather than what we might have thought of 20 years ago, selling fertilizers and so on. So part of this comes back to training. If an ag retailer is convinced, hey, I need to get into this, how do they get their staff trained and ready to go? We've got a lot of print resources that are out there, but one thing I have found is that even though these are wonderful print resources from NRCS, not necessarily every ag retailer wants to use those guide sheets. So can we start to develop some materials that are co-branded by a lot of organizations? Maybe at the bottom it says not just NRCS, but Ag Retailers Association, American Seed Trade Association, Andy's here and somewhere in the audience from ASTA. Some of our different organizations can come together to jointly publish some training materials so that we're all on the same page and so that there's a buy-in from all these different groups that need to go through further in-depth training in this area. And it's not going to be a one-time thing. 2 years from now, we're going to know more about soil health, including measurement, than we do now. In SARE, we started to take a step towards this co-branding approach. The Xerxes Society is really strong on pollinators, so we did a joint publication this past year on cover cropping for pollinators, and that has really helped us get that document out to a broader audience because we did it jointly with them. So I really hope we can do more of these types of joint training materials going forward. Just thinking of resources beyond print resources, as you do your education or communication efforts, I wanted you to be aware that one thing we put together at SARE is some visual resources. I mentioned the videos already, but you'll find that we have a photo database of several hundred photos. We had a couple of professional photographers shoot these, and they're all indexed by keyword, they're organized by topic area, and you can go in there and they're all available public domain for you to use in your publications and as you need to in different presentations. We also developed some illustrations. I'll show you a couple examples and put some of these materials into slide sets. So if you've got a county extension agent you work with or a CCA that's doing a program, they can just grab some of this and have it ready to go or tweak it for their own use. So just a couple examples of illustrations. This is one I found resonates pretty well with a range of audiences, which is just the idea when we look at cover crops as a soil health tool, it's like a Swiss Army knife tool in that it's so versatile that there's so many different benefits that are out there, unlike a lot of our ag practices. And this gives us a chance to maybe zero in on one in particular, like improving soil health, but maybe if the audience is really interested in weed management, we can talk about that. So, thinking about how do we present the concept that there's a lot of benefit to something like cover crops as a tool in our farming system. Sometimes people ask me, and I'm sure many of you have had this question, well, if I grow a cover crop, what does that really do for me, or how does it help in a dry year? We put together this simple illustration to show if you grow soybeans back to back, which a lot of farmers in Missouri do, we have over twice as many soybeans as we do corn, so a lot of continuous soybeans. That if you grow something like cereal rye in between those two cover crops, that you have the potential of getting some deeper roots from the cereal rye compared to the soybeans. And if that happens, then there's a good chance that the next year the soybean roots will go deeper than they would have otherwise, because some of those soybean roots will follow the deeper root channels of the cereal rye. Likewise, we'll have some residue from that cereal rye, and those types of things help us in a dry year. We can also be creative in just thinking about different ways to present the visuals. Some of you know Jerry Hatfield, and you probably, if you've heard him talk, you've heard him say something about elephants down under the ground. And he talks about if you added up the weight of all the soil organisms below 1 acre, that would be like 2 African elephants. And so if you go to the Soil Health Institute website now, not right now, but later today, you'll find a nice little video clip there that shows an animation of those African elephants and some other aspects of soil biology going on. And that's, again, just for the general public, a way to kind of help them recognize or learn something about what's going on below the soil. And that's the problem. We don't see what's down there in the soil. We might dig up some earthworms and see those, but it's not very easy to see bacteria or fungi or nematodes unless we've got just the right microscope. And how many of us have that in our back pocket or our pickup truck? So, we just don't know what's going on down there. So the more we can find ways through artwork or visual stories to communicate that, I think that's going to help us in the long run. All right, I want to shift from ag retailers and some general messaging to look at landowners just briefly. We find that there is 54% of U.S. cropland rented. We heard that in the last presentation, and that of that, 80% of the rented cropland is owned by non-operators. And of that, 62% of those did not previously farm. And you just heard that the trend's going to increase as land is getting passed on to another generation. And so we've got a lot of people out there who are owning the farmland and having input on how it's managed that just are not really that connected to having a farming background. So I think we need to communicate with those folks some basic things about why soil health is important. Some of it, if they're just thinking about the economics, may come back to the productivity of that soil. We do a national survey on cover crops, many of you have seen through my office, working with the Conservation Technology Information Center. This is jointly funded by SARE and the American Seed Trade Association, where we found that in 2012, the big drought year, that we got about a 10% increase in corn and soybean yields following cover crops. Now, in more recent years, with better rainfall, that yield increase has not been as large, but it's still statistically significant. Wally Tyner's group at Purdue has looked at this data, about 3% or so on corn and 4% or so on soybeans. So, those are numbers we can share with landowners to talk about how if you invest in soil health management, that in the end, that's going to pay in the productivity of your soil and the money that comes back to you, either in the way you charge your cash rent or if you're doing tenant share income. We need to help those landowners also understand what most farmers recognize, which is that there are programs out there that can help with this. They can work with the EQIP program or CSP. With SARE, we've got farmer rancher grants to help farmers try some of these practices. And of course, many of our states also have cost share programs. For example, here in Missouri, where we're at now, besides the NRCS programs, there's another $4 million in cost share for cover crops in the state. So about $10 million in total in cost share just here in Missouri each year for cover crops. Okay, the third audience I wanted to just briefly touch on is consumers. And there's a lot of ways we can try to make or help soil health be relevant for that audience. And as Ron alluded to, part of it is just connecting to their everyday life. The food they eat, the clothing they wear. If they do recreational things like fishing and boating, that may be important, but certainly we're all drinking water and care about the quality of that water. There may be other environmental things that they care about, like pollinators or wildlife or climate. So, we've got to find what resonates with these different subsets of the consumer community. I think as the Unlock the Secrets of the Soil campaign has done very effectively, we can help them realize that there's more than just earthworms and dirt beneath their feet, that not all bacteria and fungi are bad. Think about all the antibacterial soap that's sitting around right now, and that many of them are good for food production. And I think it is helpful to explain how farmer choices, and if they garden themselves, how their own gardening choices can affect the health of the soil. We can also briefly illustrate some of these basic approaches. I find that people who have no connection to ag, if you just talk to them a little bit about why you might grow something like crimson clover, they're usually pretty interested in that, if you can find a way just to connect it to what's important to them. And ultimately, it's all about that we depend on that thin layer around our planet and that we've got that shrinking base of fertile farmland, as you heard Wayne allude to earlier. So just to kind of look at a few last images from NRCS and their public service announcements, again, in case you haven't seen these, some great posters. That's really creative. Again, Ron, I love those. Be a way to kind of get out the message. This is one of my favorite things you did, Ron, you and your team, is working with an astronomer to have her talk about how it's just as important to know what's underneath our feet as the stars over our head, and how important that is to life on the planet. That was a wonderful video. If you haven't seen that, look that up on the NRCS website. Being creative with where we put some of these public service announcements, whether it's bus sides or billboards or bus stands. So just to kind of put this back together, thinking about communicating so we can build awareness through these public service announcements, farmer stories. And to me, these are about sparking interest, so that somebody asks that next question, oh, I heard something about soil health, tell me more about it. Or I heard something about cover crops. What in the heck are those things? So we want to get them to the point where they're interested in being educated. And having awareness, but taking the next step to education revolves getting the ability to act and to do so successfully, whether that's the farmer implementing a soil health practice or a decision by a consumer about the food that they're buying. So to do that, especially when we think about farmers and farm advisors, it's in-depth workshops and training and farmer-to-farmer learning. I have found that it's really important to have not only repeated exposure to the concept, but developing a personal realization for why change is needed and that opportunity to ask a question. So if you watch farmers at a farmer training event, if they walk away without having asked any question, I can just about guarantee you, Ron, they're not going to adopt that practice. But if they have a chance to ask some questions, especially of another farmer, that greatly increases their odds or likelihood of ultimately implementing that practice because they've had a chance to think through it and talk it through with somebody else. And of course, we want them to commit to that first step, whether it's as small as doing some soil health testing, applying for cost share, or maybe putting out a trial field of some of these practices. Well, I want to just end with a very general observation. Like many of you, you've worked in agriculture a long time, and it has struck me from having worked on Capitol Hill and at USDA and in universities and different settings, NGO community, that many of the issues we have in agriculture have at some point been divisive, whether it's been GMOs or pesticides, climate, agricultural labeling of food. But right now, with soil health, we have a unique opportunity in that while there is different degrees of enthusiasm and maybe a little uncertainty or maybe slight skepticism, it's not really a divisive issue at this point. It's amazing to me. We've got everybody from the most liberal environmental groups to the most conservative farm organizations saying, yeah, soil health, that's something we're interested in. So I think we've really got to take advantage of this moment in time when we have some agreement that soil health is important and move forward as fast and as far as we can. So thank you.
Well, I would like to add a comment to the aspect of education related to citizen science, because we can use the general public to help collecting data and help scientists. I would like to advertise a little bit more there, Missourians doing impact research together, who are collecting data for us, doing soil health surveys in the state of Missouri. And we have 60 sites being monitored right now and more than 600 people participating, including homeschoolers, teachers, farmers, landowners. And that's another force that we can use in education, so they can help us with the research too.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. That's a great program connected with our Science Museum here in St. Louis, correct? Yes, and so a public-oriented program, a great one to be aware of. Thank you.
Let me just add that for those of you who, like I said, I've been in the conservation business a long time, and it shows. But I have noticed since we got involved with soil health, since I drank the Kool-Aid 5 or 6 years ago, the nature of our dinner parties and cocktail parties has changed, because when people used to ask me what I did and I would tell them, grass waterways and reducing erosion, and it was like they had taken, 2 belts of scotch and an Ambien. You could see the eyes glaze over, and pretty soon they were gone. And now my wife has because the nature of soil health, and Rob alluded to it, and a number of other speakers have as well, this is the tie that binds, because they're very interested in that. When they say, what do you do? First of all, my wife goes, oh God. And then secondly, I tell them, and I try to keep my word with my wife, that, hey, I won't go on, I'll just tell them a little bit. And guess what? They want to know more. And they want to know more. And then the question they ask is, and this is the question that I think is the seminal question for all of us, ultimately they say, why aren't we doing more of it? And for that, I don't know that I have an answer yet, but we're working on it. So when you go home, you know, one of the communicators of the year one time in Markham, in a market that I used to work in, one time he won communicator of the year, and he said, it's not because I'm a particularly good storyteller, but I'll just tell that story to anybody who will listen. And I encourage you to tell that story to anyone who listens, because this one, they will listen to.
All right, thank you.